There is a certain terror that moves through society when a woman, standing firmly on her own feet, declares with unwavering certainty, "I don't need a man." It is not merely a sentence. It is a declaration of war against an emotional structure that has been taught for centuries. For Freud, the basis of human neurosis lies precisely in the tension between individual desires and social impositions. When a woman frees herself from the ancient expectation of needing to belong to someone, she strikes directly at the heart of this repression. She becomes not only a symbol of freedom, but a living threat to a system built on emotional dependence and submission disguised as love. Since childhood, most women are conditioned to seek validation, love, security, and a sense of worth through the acceptance of a man. It is a training that begins subtly, with fairy tales where happiness only comes after being chosen by a prince. Freud would say that these fantasies do not reside merely in the conscious mind, but are embedded deeply in the unconscious, forming what he called fantasies, internalized emotional truths that guide behavior without the person realizing it. So when a woman breaks these chains and declares her autonomy, she is not just facing external resistance, she is confronting the entire symbolic universe built around her identity. Society reacts violently, although often in disguised ways. She will be called arrogant, bitter, difficult, undesirable. Labels emerge not as isolated judgments, but as defense mechanisms from a collective unconscious frightened by change. Freud taught that when something threatens the order of the unconscious, it triggers a phenomenon he termed return of the repressed. Everything that was hidden, feared, or silenced resurfaces in the form of resistance, attack, devaluation. That is why the independent woman awakens so much hatred, mockery, and discomfort. She is the visible face of a silent revolution that challenges the emotional infrastructure of the world. But why exactly does a woman who declares her independence provoke so much anxiety? Freud would explain it through the conflict between the ego and the superego. The ego seeks adaptation, survival, satisfaction of desires, while the superego, shaped by parental, social, and cultural norms, demands obedience, submission, conformity. When a woman defies the command, "You must have a man to be complete," she defies not only a social expectation, but a piece of the superego itself. She forces everyone around her to question their own repressed frustrations, their unfulfilled desires, their emotional prisons. The real horror is not that a woman might be happy alone. The real horror is that she might be complete, satisfied, fulfilled, and that would force others to confront the terrifying possibility that perhaps they are not. Freud showed that what we most repress in ourselves is precisely what we most attack in others. The independent woman becomes, then, a mirror that many cannot bear to look into. She reflects a freedom that most people abandon to survive emotionally, a choice they made to be accepted, to belong, to not feel excluded. And thus arises the emotional violence that surrounds independent women. It is not physical most of the time. It is a violence of looks, judgments, subtle exclusions, disqualifications disguised as concern. You're too picky. One day you'll regret it. No one wants to grow old alone. Freud taught that repression often comes disguised as morality, common sense, or even advice given for your own good. The emotional independence of the woman who says, "I don't need a man," unmasks this entire network of disguised violence, exposing its absurdity and its cruelty. Yet despite the attacks, the loneliness, the constant questioning, there is an irreplaceable gain: the ownership of oneself. Freud believed that true emotional health is achieved when a person can reconcile their desires with reality without submitting entirely to the demands of others. The woman who affirms her autonomy is building, often painfully, the solid ground of a life that is truly hers. A life in which love, if it comes, will be a choice, not a desperate survival necessity. A life where loneliness, if it appears, will not be synonymous with failure, but with dignity. This woman is not heartless, nor is she bitter, nor incapable of love. She simply refuses to negotiate her value, her dreams, her individuality in exchange for belonging. Freud would see in her a profound movement of maturity. the passage from love as a substitute for lack to love as a conscious construction between complete beings. She does not want a partner to save her, complete her, or define her. She wants someone who walks beside her, not in front or behind. And if that does not exist, she prefers to walk alone, with the serenity of those who know that their worth is non-negotiable. In this sense, the woman who says, "I don't need a man," is the true heroine of emotional modernity. She is not free from fears, doubts, insecurities, but she faces them without surrendering her soul in exchange for protection. She knows that the price of her autonomy is high and still chooses to pay it. Freud would say that she, more than anyone, faces the uncanny, the disturbing strangeness of being free in a world that still expects her to be a prisoner. And she does so with dignity, with courage, and above all with the unshakable certainty that no love, no relationship, no social approval is worth more than her own truth. To truly understand the emotional storm provoked by a woman who claims she doesn't need a man, we need to delve even deeper into Freud's theories on sexuality and emotional dependency. According to Freud, much of our adult emotional life is a repetition, often unconscious, of our earliest childhood experiences. In other words, many adults are not looking for partners, but rather for emotional reconstructions of their primary attachments, the need to be taken care of, validated, saved from the terror of loneliness. When a woman breaks this cycle and says, "I can take care of myself," she challenges not only the collective fantasy of romantic love, but also the deepest insecurities of those who have never dared to walk alone. It is important to understand that society does not react against the woman herself, but against what she represents. She is the disruption of a pack that has existed for centuries. Women offer emotional security, affection, support, and in return, they receive protection, social acceptance, and an identity attached to the male figure. Freud would say that this is the typical case where the superego, formed by rigid and outdated norms, fiercely attacks the ego that dares to escape the control of tradition. The independent woman is judged, punished, and excluded not because she is wrong, but because her existence unmasks the fragility of an emotional order built on lies. The punishment comes in many forms. The media still portrays women alone as incomplete, sad, bitter, as if happiness were only attainable through romantic coupling. Friends, family, and even strangers feel free to question her life choices, as if her mere existence were an anomaly that needs urgent correction. Freud taught that whenever someone's life triggers strong emotional reactions in others, it is a sign that they are touching something deeply repressed. The woman who walks alone reminds others of the freedom they denied themselves in exchange for a fragile and often illusory emotional security, and there is no greater threat to the established emotional order than the woman who smiles alone satisfied, because she invalidates all the romantic myths built over centuries. The myth that you are incomplete alone, that you need someone to be happy, that loneliness is a punishment, that love is a desperate necessity and not a conscious choice. Freud would say that these myths are part of the unconscious collective neurosis, which imprisons people in emotional roles that no longer make sense, but are perpetuated by fear, guilt, and shame. Moreover, the independent woman challenges male narcissism in a profound way. Freud developed the concept of narcissistic injury to explain how individuals react with anger and resentment when their sense of importance is questioned. The man who has always been taught that his value is measured by his ability to conquer, dominate, and protect feels emotionally disarmed before a woman who says, "I don't need you." It is a direct affront to the male superego, which demands recognition, admiration, validation. And without these emotional rewards, many men feel not only frustrated, but existentially threatened. It is not surprising, therefore, that the most aggressive reactions to female independence often come from men who feel most emotionally fragile. Instead of recognizing their own vulnerability, they project it onto the woman, attacking her, disqualifying her, trying to reduce her to the old role of the fragile, submissive, emotionally dependent being. Freud would say that this is a clear case of projection, attributing to the other what one cannot tolerate in oneself. In this sense, the woman who says, "I don't need a man," becomes a psychological battlefield, where each projection, each wound, Each unfulfilled frustration of others explodes into disguised aggression. But despite the attacks, there is an inalienable strength in her stance. The strength of those who have learned to live with their fears, their loneliness, their insecurities without needing to anesthetize themselves with a relationship just to feel complete. Freud taught that true freedom is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to coexist with it without succumbing to neurosis. The independent woman embodies this truth. She feels the fear of being alone, the anguish of being judged, the pain of not belonging. But even so, she continues. She walks forward. She refuses to sell her soul in exchange for a fake emotional refuge. And for those who attack her, who ridicule her, who try to diminish her, she becomes the most powerful possible lesson that emotional freedom is possible, that it is legitimate, that it is profoundly dignified. Freud would see in her a symbol of the overcoming of infantile neurosis, the passage from need to desire, from emotional dependency to authentic love, a love that may come, but that no longer defines who she is, a love that does not fill a void, but expands an already full life. In this way, every step the independent woman takes is a silent revolution. Each smile she gives, each dream she fulfills, each tear she wipes alone, without collapsing, each night she faces without false company, each morning she wakes up alone but whole, all of it is a profound political act. Freud taught that the human being only becomes truly free when he assumes the anguish of freedom without running back to the easy refuge of dependency. The woman who says, "I don't need a man," assumes this anguish with an elegance and courage that few dare to imitate. She is not against love. She is not against men. She is against the lie that her existence needs to revolve around being chosen, accepted, validated by a man. She understands that love, when it happens, must be a conscious meeting, not a desperate transaction. Freud would say that she is the living embodiment of the sublimation process, transforming primitive emotional needs into conscious, profound, dignified choices. And that terrifies those who still live emotionally trapped in the archaic roles that modernity so desperately tries to leave behind. Thus, the woman who says, "I don't need a man," is much more than an individual claiming her freedom. She is a living testimony that another emotional order is possible, that emotional maturity is attainable, that happiness does not need to come from external validation, but can be built from within, and that, in the end, true revolution is not made with shouts or marches. It is made above all in the silent, courageous, and lonely choice to be oneself, fully and irrevocably. If we dive even deeper into Freud's theories, it becomes evident that society's unease with the independent woman is not merely a sociological phenomenon. It is a psychic rupture, a collective confrontation with repressed fears that have been buried for generations. According to Freud, the human being is driven by internal conflicts between the instincts of life, eros, and the instincts of death, thanatos. The woman who claims she does not need a man disrupts the eros illusion that romantic relationships are always a symbol of vitality, of life. She reveals that sometimes what is called love is only a social mask for fear of loneliness, a desperate attempt to escape the abyss of individuality. Thus, when a woman asserts herself without the need for male validation, she forces everyone around her to face the reality of their own existential emptiness. Freud would say that she breaks the infantile fantasy of the completing other, that idea deeply rooted in the unconscious that, without the love of another, we are fragments, half-beings, broken. The independent woman shows that fullness can exist without this external complement, and this realization generates panic among those who have built their entire identities based on emotional dependence. This is why the independent woman is often called arrogant, selfish, difficult, cold. Not because she is truly any of these things, but because her existence unbalances the neurotic structures that govern emotional relationships. Freud pointed out that the unconscious reacts violently when faced with what threatens its defense mechanisms: projection, denial, rationalization. All these defenses are activated by those who, faced with an autonomous woman, cannot bear to see their own fragility exposed. At the same time, Freud would also recognize the tragic beauty in the independent woman's journey. For emotional autonomy comes at a price. She carries a double burden, the burden of her own loneliness and the burden of being the mirror of others' cowardice. She walks paths that many fear even to contemplate. She makes choices that demand not only courage, but an immense capacity for resilience. To be independent, Freud teaches us, is to endure the anguish of freedom, of choice, of existential responsibility. But there is also liberation in this anguish, a silent, radiant liberation that can only be experienced by those who dare to confront life without emotional anesthetics. The woman who does not need a man chooses her companions based on affinity, not survival instinct. She builds relationships where love is not a remedy for existential anguish, but a free and conscious celebration of two whole lives. Freud would see this as the overcoming of the Oedipal complex, the final maturity of the ego, no longer needing parental substitutes or saviors. And it is this maturity that society resists. Because a mature society demands mature individuals. It demands people who assume their desires, their fears, their responsibilities without transferring them onto others. The independent woman, therefore, is a threat to the emotional infantilism that still reigns in many romantic and family dynamics. Her mere existence questions not only the romantic model, but also the economic, religious, and political systems that depend on emotionally dependent individuals to perpetuate themselves. It is no accident that marketing, movies, songs, and even literature still sell the idea that the great dream of a woman's life is to find a man to complete her. There is no greater market strategy than creating an eternal need. And romantic love, as traditionally conceived, is the perfect need. Freud would cynically smile at this. The external market reflects the internal market of desires, where needs are manufactured, cultivated, and never truly satisfied. However, the woman who says she does not need a man tears apart this narrative. She refuses to consume the emotional products offered to her. She dismantles the fantasy that happiness is something that can be bought, conquered, or found in the arms of another. She places the heavy and luminous responsibility for her own life in her own hands. Freud would call this sublimation, transforming primitive needs into creative and liberating forces. There is therefore a sacred rebellion in the independent woman, a rebellion against alienation, against the emotional colonization that has been imposed on women for millennia. By walking alone, she frees not only herself, but all those who, even if secretly, dream of a different life. A life where being alone is not a curse, but a legitimate, beautiful choice. A life where love, when it happens, does not fill a void, but overflows a full existence. This is why the independent woman attracts so much admiration and hatred at the same time, because she embodies what many desire but few have the courage to pursue. She is the living proof that another emotional path is possible, that it is possible to exist beyond the expectations, projections, and emotional traps of the past. Freud would say that she is the embodiment of the new woman, not the one who competes with men, but the one who no longer needs their permission to exist. In this way, each gesture of the independent woman, each project she creates, each friendship she cultivates, each trip she takes alone, each night she sleeps peacefully without waiting for a text message, is a deep emotional revolution, a silent and powerful revolution that shakes the unconscious structures of a world still trapped in ancient neuroses. And the beauty of this revolution is that it does not need banners, slogans, or protests. It only needs her being, fully assumed, proudly affirmed. Thus, the woman who says, "I don't need a man," is not merely making a personal statement. She is opening paths. She is expanding possibilities. She is daring to exist without asking for permission. And that, Freud would say, is the most authentic, courageous, and revolutionary thing a human being can do. Following the Freudian logic, the independent woman, who claims she does not need a man to complete her, triggers an unconscious collapse in the collective imagination. Freud taught that much of our emotional structure is built on projections, on infantile desires that seek in others the reflection of what we lack in ourselves. Therefore, when a woman asserts her autonomy, she also destroys the fantasy that someone external is responsible for our happiness. She forces a confrontation with the emptiness, with the inner void that many try to mask with relationships. Thus, society labels the independent woman as a threat, an anomaly to be corrected. Films portray her as bitter, lonely, or secretly frustrated. Songs lament her loneliness, implying that behind her strength, there is only sadness. Family and friends suggest that her independence is arrogance, that it is only a matter of time before she repents. All of this, Freud would say, is nothing more than a desperate attempt to maintain the illusions that sustain the fragile collective ego. This strategy, however, reveals a profound paradox. By trying to diminish the independent woman, society confesses its own insecurity. The more it criticizes her, the more it reveals its fear. Fear of what? Of freedom, of the responsibility that comes with emotional autonomy. Because to be free is also to be responsible for one's own choices, one's own happiness, one's own loneliness. And many prefer to transfer this burden to others, even if it means living a mediocre life. Freud would not see the independent woman as a symptom of decadence, as some conservatives argue. Quite the contrary, he would see her as an inevitable result of a psychic maturation process, a being that no longer needs illusions to endure existence, a being that can confront the abyss without fainting, that can create meaning for herself without waiting for external validation. In this sense, the independent woman is a revolutionary figure, not because she seeks to destroy the masculine, but because she dares to exist without emotional crutches. And herein lies the greatest affront. She lives, she laughs, she builds, she thrives, without seeking permission, without apologizing for existing. Her presence alone is a political act, an emotional declaration that says, I am sufficient. Freud would say that she has overcome the need for the paternal figure as a source of protection and validation. She no longer seeks in the other the confirmation of her worth. She has discovered that her value is intrinsic, inalienable. However, this path is not without pain. Many independent women face isolation, judgment, emotional sabotage. They face a world that, although modernized on the surface, still harbors archaic expectations deep down. A world that still finds it difficult to understand that a woman can choose to be alone without being unhappy, that she can refuse the traditional script without losing her humanity. Freud would understand this pain. He would say that it is the price of freedom. Just as the individual must pay the price of anguish when detaching from parental figures, the woman must pay the price of solitude, of misunderstanding, when detaching from the societal projections. But in that pain, there is growth. In that rupture, there is true maturity. And it is precisely because of these ruptures that the world slowly transforms. Each independent woman who refuses to submit to the old norms opens a crack in the system, a crack through which future generations can pass more freely, more consciously, more humanly. Freud would see in this process the inexorable movement of the libido toward life, creation, sublimation. Thus, the woman who says, I don't need a man, is not an enemy of love. She is an enemy of dependence. She is not rejecting emotional bonds. She is rejecting the illusion that her value depends on them. She is not closing herself off to affection. She is opening herself to authentic relationships, relationships based on mutual freedom, not on mutual slavery. Her strength is not a wall against others. It is a bridge toward herself, a bridge that, paradoxically, allows her to love more deeply, more truly when she chooses to love. Because love for her is not a need. It is a celebration. It is not a lifeline. It is a gift. Freud would say that she has reached the highest stage of sublimation, transforming what was once compulsion into conscious, luminous creation. Therefore, when you see a woman who dares to walk alone, who dares to speak her truth, who dares to live without emotional crutches, know that you are witnessing a historical, emotional, and psychic revolution, a silent revolution, but one that shakes the foundations of a still emotionally infantile world. And if you feel uncomfortable, questioned, or even irritated by her existence, ask yourself, is it really her that disturbs you? Or is it the mirror she places before you, reflecting your own fears, your own unfulfilled desires, your own hidden dependencies. Freud would smile at this moment because the truth is always uncomfortable, but it is in discomfort that transformation is born. And the woman who says she does not need a man is not killing love. She is saving it. She is saving love from emotional blackmail, from neurotic dependencies, from desperate bargains disguised as romance. She is saving love for what it truly is, an encounter between two whole beings, two autonomous souls, two lives that choose to walk together, but that do not fear walking alone. Thus, to every independent woman who dares to exist, know that you are not alone. You are the future. You are the healing of old emotional wounds. You are the living proof that it is possible to love without ceasing to be yourself, that it is possible to live without begging for permission to exist. And that is the most beautiful, courageous, and revolutionary thing a human being can do.